Sometimes the universe has a way of correcting the greatest injustices when human systems fail. In the unforgiving world of naval command, where tradition and hierarchy rule with iron fists, one woman's fight for truth would shake the very foundations of maritime authority. What happened next would make even the most seasoned sailors question everything they thought they knew about the sea's mysterious power. This is not just a story about wrongful dismissal or military corruption. This is about the moment when nature itself seemed to intervene in human affairs, delivering swift and undeniable justice that no court of law could have orchestrated. The events that unfolded in the hours following Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen's dismissal would become legend among those who served the seas, whispered in mess halls and recounted in ports across 7 continents. Some say it was coincidence. Others call it divine intervention. But those who witnessed what happened that day know the truth. Sometimes the ocean chooses its own champions, and woe to those who stand against them. The salt air carried an unusual tension that morning as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen walked across the deck of the USS Meridian. 22 years of naval service had taught her to read the subtle signs that other officers missed, the way sailors avoided eye contact, the hushed conversations that stopped when she approached, the deliberate absence of Admiral Morrison from his usual morning inspection. Something was brewing, and Sarah had a sinking feeling she was at the center of it. Sarah had joined the Navy straight out of the Naval Academy, driven by her grandfather's stories of serving in World War II. Her grandfather, a Chinese immigrant who had fought bravely for his adopted country, had instilled in her an unwavering sense of duty and honor. These values had guided her through every challenge, from the early days when she was one of only a handful of women in her unit, to her current position as one of the most respected navigation officers in the Pacific Fleet. The trouble had started 3 months earlier during a routine supply mission near the contested waters of the South China Sea. Sarah had been on the bridge when they encountered what appeared to be a civilian fishing vessel in distress. Standard protocol required them to offer assistance, but Admiral Morrison had ordered them to ignore the vessel and maintain course. Sarah had questioned the order, pointing out that maritime law required them to render aid to any vessel in distress, regardless of nationality. Morrison had been furious. "You don't question orders, Commander," he had barked. "That vessel could be anything: pirates, enemy scouts, or worse. We have our mission priorities." Sarah had reluctantly complied, but the image of that small boat listing dangerously in rough seas had haunted her for weeks. Later intelligence reports would confirm her worst fears. The vessel had indeed been civilian fishermen, and 3 lives were lost when their boat eventually capsized. The incident should have ended there, but Sarah couldn't let it go. She had filed a formal report questioning the decision, citing international maritime law and naval regulations. She had tried to work through proper channels, meeting with Morrison privately to express her concerns. The Admiral had dismissed her worries, claiming operational security took precedence over humanitarian concerns. When Sarah persisted, Morrison's attitude toward her shifted from professional irritation to outright hostility. The harassment began subtly. Sarah found herself excluded from important briefings, passed over for assignments she was clearly qualified for, and subjected to excessive scrutiny of her work. Morrison began finding fault with reports that had previously been commended, questioning decisions that other officers would never be challenged on, and making thinly veiled comments about officers who couldn't follow orders without question. Sarah documented everything meticulously, knowing that her military career was under threat. She sought advice from her mentor, Captain Rodriguez, who had guided her career for over a decade. Rodriguez was sympathetic but cautious. "Morrison has powerful friends in Washington," he warned. "If you're going to challenge him, you better be prepared for the consequences." The breaking point came during a joint operation with Allied forces. Sarah had been assigned to coordinate navigation for a complex multi-vessel exercise. Her calculations and route planning were flawless, earning praise from international observers and fellow officers. The operation was deemed a complete success, with Sarah's expertise playing a crucial role in its execution. For a moment, it seemed like the professional recognition might overshadow Morrison's personal vendetta. Instead, it made things worse. At the post-operation briefing, Morrison publicly criticized Sarah's performance, claiming her navigation had put the entire fleet at risk. The accusations were demonstrably false. The official logs and GPS data clearly showed her calculations had been perfect. Other officers in the room shifted uncomfortably, knowing they were witnessing a gross injustice but unwilling to challenge a superior officer. Sarah maintained her composure during the meeting, but inside she was seething. After the briefing, several junior officers approached her privately to express their support. Ensign Martinez, a young officer Sarah had mentored, was particularly upset. "Ma'am, everyone knows what you did was exemplary. This isn't right." Sarah appreciated the support, but she also knew it put these young officers at risk. Morrison's influence extended far beyond her own career. That evening, Sarah made the decision that would change everything. She contacted the Inspector General's office and filed a formal complaint against Admiral Morrison, alleging harassment, discrimination, and violation of maritime protocols. She knew it was career suicide, but she also knew she couldn't continue to serve under a commander who put ego and prejudice above duty and human life. The complaint triggered a formal investigation. For 3 weeks, investigators interviewed crew members, reviewed records, and examined the incidents Sarah had documented. Several officers came forward with their own accounts of Morrison's behavior, painting a picture of a commanding officer who ruled through intimidation and favoritism rather than competence and fairness. Morrison's response was swift and vicious. He used every connection and every technicality to discredit Sarah's complaint. He questioned her mental fitness for duty, suggested her judgment had been compromised by stress, and implied that her accusations were motivated by personal ambition rather than professional concern. His allies in the command structure rallied to his defense, characterizing the complaint as an attack on naval hierarchy and discipline. The investigation dragged on for months, taking a severe toll on Sarah's reputation and morale. She found herself isolated, with many officers afraid to associate with her. The stress affected her sleep, her appetite, and her performance. Friends and family urged her to withdraw the complaint and try to salvage what remained of her career, but Sarah refused to back down. The principle was too important, and the precedent too dangerous to ignore. During the investigation, new evidence emerged that should have vindicated Sarah completely. Communications logs showed that Morrison had indeed ignored multiple distress calls during their South China Sea mission, not just the one Sarah had reported. Weather data confirmed that the conditions had been dangerous enough to warrant immediate assistance to any vessel in distress. Most damning of all, crew members testified that Morrison had made explicit statements about not wanting to help foreign vessels, regardless of the humanitarian implications. Despite this evidence, the investigation's conclusions were disappointing. While acknowledging that Morrison's handling of the distress call situation had been questionable, the report stopped short of finding him guilty of serious misconduct. The investigators cited operational pressures and the complex nature of command decisions in contested waters as mitigating factors. Sarah's complaint was deemed partially substantiated but not serious enough to warrant significant disciplinary action against Morrison. The Admiral received a formal reprimand and mandatory training on international maritime law. Sarah, meanwhile, found her career effectively over. Though technically exonerated, she had committed the unforgivable sin of challenging authority. The Navy's Old Boys Network closed ranks around Morrison, while Sarah became a cautionary tale about the consequences of speaking truth to power. Captain Rodriguez delivered the news with obvious reluctance. "They're transferring you to a desk job in San Diego," he said, unable to meet her eyes. "Officially, it's a lateral move. Unofficially, everyone knows what it means." Sarah nodded, having expected as much. The Navy had found a way to punish her without admitting wrongdoing, bureaucratic revenge wrapped in administrative language. The final meeting with Morrison was scheduled for the following morning. Sarah spent that last night aboard the Meridian walking the deck she had called home for 3 years, saying goodbye to the life she had built and the career she had devoted herself to. The stars were particularly bright that night, and the ocean was unusually calm. For someone who had spent most of her adult life at sea, the tranquility felt like a farewell gift from the waters she loved. As dawn broke on what would be her last day aboard the Meridian, Sarah prepared herself for the confrontation she knew was coming. Morrison wouldn't be content with simply transferring her, he would want to deliver one final humiliation, to ensure she understood the price of defying him. Sarah straightened her uniform, checked her appearance one last time, and prepared to face whatever vindictive punishment the Admiral had planned for her final moments aboard his ship. The Admiral's quarters reeked of stale cigar smoke and arrogance when Sarah knocked at precisely 0800 hours. Morrison's voice barked enter with the kind of authority that had intimidated countless officers over his 30-year career. Sarah stepped inside, maintaining perfect military bearing despite knowing this would be one of the most humiliating moments of her professional life. Morrison didn't look up from his paperwork immediately, a calculated power play designed to emphasize her diminished status. When he finally raised his eyes, his expression held the satisfied look of a man who had successfully crushed an opponent. "Sit down, Commander," he said, gesturing dismissively toward the chair across from his massive oak desk. The desk itself was a monument to Morrison's ego, covered with commendations, photographs with high-ranking officials, and maritime artifacts that spoke more to his ambition than his achievements. "I suppose you think you've won something with this investigation circus," Morrison began, his voice dripping with contempt. "Filing complaints, questioning orders, undermining command authority. 22 years of service, and this is how you choose to end it, as a troublemaker who couldn't follow simple instructions." Sarah remained silent, knowing that any response would only fuel Morrison's anger. She had learned long ago that men like Morrison fed on confrontation, and the best defense was to deny them the reaction they craved. Her silence seemed to irritate him further, his face reddening as he continued his verbal assault. "You could have had a distinguished career, Commander Chen. Your technical skills were adequate, your record was clean until this nonsense, and you had the respect of your peers. But you had to push it, didn't you? You had to question authority, to think you knew better than your commanding officer." Morrison stood up and walked around the desk, positioning himself to loom over Sarah in another display of dominance. "The truth is, Commander, you never understood what military service really means. It's not about individual conscience or moral superiority. It's about following orders, maintaining discipline, and trusting that your superiors have information and perspective that you lack. Your grandfather served with distinction because he understood this principle. It's a shame his granddaughter never learned the same lesson." The reference to her grandfather was a deliberate provocation, and Sarah felt her jaw tighten despite her efforts to remain composed. Morrison had done his research, knew exactly which buttons to push to get a reaction. Her grandfather's service record was exemplary. He had indeed followed orders without question, but he had also served in a time when those orders were clearly in service of justice and freedom. The comparison was as unfair as it was cruel. "Your new assignment begins Monday," Morrison continued, returning to his desk and picking up a file folder. "Administrative Liaison for Naval Procurement Contracts in San Diego. You'll be reviewing purchase orders for office supplies, maintenance equipment, and catering services. Quite a change from navigation and tactical operations, but I'm sure you'll find it suitable to your particular talents." The assignment was designed to be humiliating, a highly qualified navigation officer reduced to checking invoices for paper clips and coffee makers. Sarah understood the message perfectly. This was what happened to officers who forgot their place, who challenged the system instead of working within it. Morrison wanted her to spend her remaining years in service as a living reminder to other potential troublemakers. "There is one more matter," Morrison said, his tone becoming even more menacing. "Your security clearance will be under review as part of your transfer. Given the questions that have been raised about your judgment and reliability, it's possible that your access to classified information may be restricted. I'm sure you understand the implications for your future prospects, both within the Navy and in civilian life." This was the killing blow Morrison had been saving for last. Without security clearance, Sarah's options would be severely limited. Most positions that would utilize her skills and experience required some level of classified access. Morrison was essentially threatening to blacklist her from any meaningful employment in her field of expertise. It was a level of vindictiveness that went far beyond professional disagreement. It was personal destruction. Sarah finally spoke, her voice steady despite the rage building inside her. "Is there anything else, Admiral? If not, I have personal effects to pack and administrative matters to complete before my departure." Morrison's smile was wolfish. Oh, there is one more thing, Commander. Your departure from this vessel will be immediate and public. The crew needs to see what happens to officers who put their personal agendas ahead of unit cohesion and military discipline. You'll be transferred by water taxi at 1030 hours, and I've arranged for the crew to be on deck for departure ceremonies. Consider it a teaching moment for the younger officers. The public humiliation was the final twist of the knife. Morrison wanted every sailor on the ship to witness Sarah's disgrace, to see her cast out in shame. It was a medieval display of power, designed to crush not just Sarah but any other officer who might be tempted to follow her example. The message would be clear: this is what happens to those who challenge authority, regardless of their motives or the merit of their concerns. Sarah stood up, her military bearing intact despite the emotional devastation she felt inside. I understand, Admiral. I'll be ready for transfer at the designated time. She turned to leave, but Morrison's voice stopped her. Commander Chen, he called out, and she turned back to face him. I want you to remember this moment for the rest of your life. Remember that your principles and your moral superiority led you to disgrace and exile. Remember that following your conscience cost you everything you worked for. Maybe next time you'll think twice before questioning your betters. Sarah met his gaze with steady eyes. I'll remember, Admiral. I'll remember that some things are more important than career advancement, and that integrity matters more than the approval of corrupt superiors. I'll remember that standing up for what's right sometimes requires personal sacrifice. Morrison's face darkened at her defiant response. Get out of my sight, Commander. And don't let the door hit you on your way out of the Navy. Sarah left Morrison's quarters with her head held high, despite the emotional turmoil churning inside her. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of packing personal belongings, completing administrative paperwork, and saying goodbye to the few friends brave enough to approach her. Ensign Martinez was particularly emotional, tears in her eyes as she thanked Sarah for being a mentor and role model. You did the right thing, ma'am, Martinez said quietly. Whatever they say, whatever happens, you stood up for what was right. That matters more than they want you to believe. Other crew members offered more subtle shows of support: a firm handshake, a meaningful look, a quiet good luck whispered as they passed in the corridor. These small gestures meant more to Sarah than any official commendation, evidence that her sacrifice had not gone unnoticed by those she had served alongside. At 1015 hours, Sarah made her way to the main deck, carrying her duffel bag and the small box containing personal items from her quarters. True to Morrison's word, the crew had been assembled on deck for her departure. Most looked uncomfortable, aware that they were being forced to participate in a petty display of vindictiveness. Some couldn't meet her eyes, while others offered encouraging nods and expressions of support. Morrison appeared on the upper deck, positioned to oversee Sarah's humiliation from above. His satisfaction was visible as he surveyed the assembled crew and prepared to watch his enemy's final defeat. The water taxi was approaching, its engine noise growing louder as it closed the distance to the meridian. Sarah checked her watch: 1028 hours. 2 minutes until her 22-year naval career would officially end in disgrace. The weather, which had been calm and clear all morning, suddenly began to change. Dark clouds appeared on the horizon, moving toward the ship with unusual speed. The wind picked up, causing the American flag above the bridge to snap and flutter more vigorously. Several crew members noticed the sudden shift, glancing up at the sky with concern. Sarah felt the change in the air pressure, the subtle shift in the ocean's rhythm that experienced sailors learned to recognize. After 2 decades at sea, she was sensitive to the ocean's moods, and something about this weather pattern felt different, not threatening, exactly, but purposeful, as if the sea itself was responding to the drama playing out on the Meridian's deck. The water taxi pulled alongside the ship, its pilot calling out arrival confirmation to the officer of the deck. Sarah walked toward the gangway, her fellow sailors creating an informal honor corridor despite Morrison's attempt to make her departure shameful. Their respect for her remained intact, regardless of the Admiral's political maneuvering. As Sarah reached the top of the gangway, Morrison's voice called out from above. Commander Chen, he announced loudly enough for the entire crew to hear, you are hereby relieved of duty aboard this vessel. Your conduct has been found wanting, your judgment questionable, and your loyalty suspect. The United States Navy no longer requires your services in any meaningful capacity." Sarah paused at the top of the gangway and looked up at Morrison, her expression calm despite the fury burning inside her. The wind was growing stronger now, and the dark clouds had moved much closer than seemed possible in such a short time. "Admiral Morrison," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the deck, "I leave this ship with my honor intact and my conscience clear. I cannot say the same for everyone present." The challenge in her words was unmistakable, and Morrison's face flushed red with anger. He opened his mouth to deliver another cutting response, but at that exact moment, the weather changed dramatically. The wind suddenly intensified to near gale force, and the first drops of rain began to fall. But these weren't ordinary raindrops, they were large, heavy, and strangely warm, falling with unusual force and precision. Sarah descended the gangway as the weather continued to deteriorate rapidly around them. She had experienced sudden squalls before, but nothing quite like this. The wind seemed to have direction and purpose, the rain fell in patterns that defied meteorological explanation, and the sea itself began to respond with waves that grew larger and more aggressive by the minute. As she stepped aboard the water taxi, Sarah looked back at the Meridian one last time. Morrison was still standing on the upper deck, no longer smiling, his attention now focused on the rapidly changing weather conditions. The crew was beginning to secure equipment and prepare for what was clearly going to be a significant storm. In all her years at sea, Sarah had never seen weather develop so quickly or with such apparent intention. The water taxi pulled away from the Meridian just as the storm reached its full fury. Sarah watched from the stern as the ship that had been her home for 3 years disappeared into the gray curtain of rain and wind. She didn't know it yet, but her departure marked the beginning of events that would vindicate her in ways no court or investigation ever could. The water taxi pitched violently as it struggled against waves that had grown from manageable swells to towering walls of water in less than 20 minutes. Sarah braced herself in the small cabin, watching through salt-streaked windows as the ocean transformed from its earlier calm into something resembling nature's fury unleashed. The pilot, a grizzled civilian contractor named Murphy who had been running personnel transfers for the Navy for 15 years, shouted over the engine noise and howling wind. "Commander, I've never seen anything like this," Murphy called out, his weathered face tight with concern. Weather Service showed clear skies for the next 6 hours. This storm came out of nowhere. He wrestled with the wheel as another massive wave crashed over the bow, sending spray cascading across the windscreen. "We might need to turn back to the Meridian until this blows over." Sarah peered through the rain and spray toward the ship they had just left. The Meridian was barely visible through the storm, but she could make out the emergency lighting that indicated the crew was battening down for severe weather. Something about the storm's timing and intensity struck her as more than coincidental, though she kept that thought to herself. "How far to the harbor?" she asked Murphy. "About 12 nautical miles, but at this rate, it's going to take us 3 times longer than usual," Murphy replied, adjusting their heading to take the waves at a better angle. "This boat's built for rough water, but I've got to respect what the ocean's throwing at us." Behind them, the situation aboard the Meridian was rapidly deteriorating. Admiral Morrison had been forced to cut short his moment of triumph as the storm struck with unprecedented intensity. The weather had gone from clear skies to near hurricane conditions in minutes, catching the crew completely unprepared. Emergency announcements echoed through the ship's corridors as sailors rushed to secure loose equipment and prepare for heavy seas. On the bridge, Morrison barked orders at his officers while privately seething about the timing of the storm. His carefully orchestrated humiliation of Sarah Chen had been interrupted by what meteorologists would later describe as a once-in-a-century weather anomaly. The storm had appeared on no forecasting models, developed with impossible speed, and seemed to be centered precisely on their position. "Sir, we're taking on water in the lower compartments," reported Lieutenant Barnes, his voice tight with stress. "The pumps are working, but we've got flooding in compartments C4 and C7. Engineering requests permission to shut down non-essential systems to redirect power to bilge pumps." Morrison's face went pale. The Meridian was a modern destroyer, built to handle severe weather, but the combination of massive waves, driving rain, and what appeared to be microbursts of wind were testing the ship's limits. Permission granted, he snapped. And, get me a damage report from all department heads. The irony was not lost on the crew. Sarah Chen, the navigation officer Morrison had just cast out in disgrace, was widely regarded as one of the finest weather readers in the fleet. Her ability to predict and prepare for severe weather conditions had saved ships and lives on multiple occasions. Now, faced with the storm of the century, they were without her expertise at the moment they needed it most. Chief Petty Officer Williams, who had served under Sarah for 2 years, found himself thinking about her weather predictions as he supervised damage control efforts. Sarah had always emphasized that the ocean was a living entity that demanded respect and attention. "The sea remembers everything," she used to say during training sessions. "Every insult, every act of arrogance, every moment when we forget that we're guests in her domain." Meanwhile, the water taxi carrying Sarah continued its struggle toward shore. Despite the violent conditions, Murphy proved to be an exceptional pilot, using his decades of experience to navigate the chaotic seas. Sarah found herself admiring his skill while simultaneously marveling at the storm's intensity and apparent focus on their small area of ocean. "Commander," Murphy called out over the noise, "you ever see anything like this in your time with the Navy?" He was fighting to maintain course as the wind seemed to shift direction every few minutes, as if the storm itself was trying to push them toward some predetermined destination. "Never," Sarah replied honestly. "I've been through typhoons in the Pacific, hurricanes in the Atlantic, and every kind of weather the ocean can throw at you. But this feels different. More personal, if that makes any sense." Murphy nodded grimly. "It does make sense, actually. My grandfather was a fisherman, and he used to tell stories about storms that came when the sea was angry about something. Said the ocean had its own sense of justice, and sometimes it would act on behalf of those who treated it with proper respect." As if responding to their conversation, the storm intensified even further. Waves that had been 20 feet tall grew to 30, then 40 feet. The wind reached sustained speeds that would have qualified as a Category 3 hurricane, with gusts that exceeded 150 miles per hour. The National Weather Service, monitoring the anomaly from their regional headquarters, could only watch in amazement as their instruments recorded conditions that defied explanation. Back on the Meridian, Admiral Morrison was facing the fight of his career not against a human enemy, but against the sea itself. The ship was listing 15 degrees to port, taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. Emergency protocols were in full effect, with damage control teams working frantically to shore up weakened bulkheads and seal breaches in the hull. Admiral called out the communications officer, his voice barely audible over the storm noise that penetrated even the bridge's reinforced structure. "We're receiving distress calls from 2 other vessels in the area. A cargo ship about 20 miles south is reporting engine failure, and a Coast Guard cutter is requesting assistance with a medical emergency." Morrison's blood ran cold. Standard protocol required him to respond to any distress call, to render assistance to vessels in need regardless of the danger to his own ship. It was the same maritime law that Sarah Chen had cited 3 months earlier when he had ignored the fishing vessel in distress. The parallel was so exact, so perfectly timed, that it felt like the universe was presenting him with a cosmic test. "Sir," the communications officer prompted. "How should we respond to the distress calls?" Morrison looked out at the raging sea, his mind racing. His ship was in genuine danger, taking on water and struggling to maintain stability in conditions that pushed every system to its limits. Responding to the distress calls would require changing course, exposing the Meridian to even more dangerous wave angles, and potentially putting his entire crew at risk. But Morrison also knew that every eye on the bridge was watching him, waiting to see if he would make the same mistake twice. The crew remembered Sarah's complaint about the fishing vessel, knew that his refusal to render aid had contributed to the loss of life. If he ignored these new distress calls, he would confirm every accusation she had made against him. "Plot a course for the cargo ship," Morrison ordered, his voice barely steady. "And signal the Coast Guard cutter that we're en route to assist." The decision felt like swallowing broken glass, but he had no choice. The storm had backed him into a corner where his only option was to do the right thing. The Meridian changed course, turning into the storm's full fury as it headed toward the distressed cargo ship. The maneuver was extremely dangerous in such conditions, but the crew executed it with professional precision despite their perilous situation. As they fought their way through mountainous seas toward the rescue operation, more than one sailor found themselves thinking about Sarah Chen and wondering if her presence might have made the navigation easier. 20 miles away, Sarah's water taxi was finally approaching the harbor. The storm had followed them most of the way to shore, but as they entered the protected waters of the bay, the wind began to die down and the waves diminished to manageable levels. Murphy guided his battered vessel toward the pier with obvious relief, his hands cramped from hours of fighting the wheel. "Commander," he said as they tied up at the dock, "I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I've never experienced anything like that." It was almost like the storm was trying to tell us something. Sarah gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, her mind still processing the extraordinary events of the day. The timing of the storm, its unprecedented intensity, and the way it had seemed to focus on the exact area where her humiliation was taking place struck her as far more than coincidental. But she was a woman of science and logic, trained to look for rational explanations rather than supernatural intervention. As she stepped onto the pier, Sarah's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Captain Rodriguez. His voice was tense with concern and excitement. "Sarah, where are you? Are you safe? The whole fleet is talking about this storm that came out of nowhere." "I'm fine, Captain. Just reached port." "What's the situation with the Meridian?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Morrison's in the fight of his life out there. The ship's taken significant damage, and he's attempting a rescue operation in conditions that would challenge an experienced crew even in perfect weather. The irony is incredible, he's facing the exact same type of situation he criticized you for wanting to handle 3 months ago." Sarah absorbed this information with mixed emotions. She felt no satisfaction at Morrison's predicament, but there was a certain poetic justice in the timing. "Any casualties?" "Not yet, but the night's not over." "Sarah, there's something else you should know. The Inspector General's office called me 20 minutes ago. They've received new information about Morrison's conduct, and they're reopening the investigation. Apparently, several officers came forward after your departure today, inspired by your example to speak the truth about what they've witnessed." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. After months of feeling isolated and defeated, learning that her stand had encouraged others to come forward was overwhelming. "What kind of information?" Details about the fishing vessel incident, evidence of Morrison's pattern of ignoring distress calls, and testimony about his discriminatory treatment of female and minority officers. Your complaint opened the floodgates, Sarah. People are finally willing to speak up because you showed them it was possible to challenge the system. As Sarah processed this revelation, she looked out at the harbor where the storm was finally beginning to dissipate. The timing of everything, her dismissal, the storm, Morrison's crisis, and now the renewed investigation, seemed to form a pattern that transcended simple coincidence. Whether it was divine intervention, natural justice, or simply the universe's way of correcting imbalances, the events of this day would be remembered and discussed for years to come. The next morning brought news that would vindicate Sarah completely and end Morrison's career in disgrace. The Meridian had successfully completed both rescue operations, saving the cargo ship's crew and providing medical assistance to the Coast Guard cutter. But the effort had cost Morrison everything. His ship had suffered severe damage, requiring months of repairs and a formal investigation into how a modern destroyer had been so unprepared for severe weather conditions. More damaging still, Morrison's handling of the crisis had been closely monitored by Fleet Command. His initial hesitation to respond to the distress calls, combined with his poor preparation for the storm, confirmed everything Sarah had alleged about his character and judgment. The crew members who had witnessed his indecision during the crisis added their voices to the growing chorus of complaints against him. Within a week, Admiral Morrison was relieved of command and facing a court-martial for dereliction of duty, discrimination, and violation of maritime law. The investigation revealed a pattern of abuse and incompetence that had been hidden by his political connections for years. Officers who had been afraid to speak out finally felt safe to tell their stories, and the picture that emerged was damning. Sarah, meanwhile, found herself suddenly in demand. The Navy, embarrassed by the Morrison scandal and eager to demonstrate its commitment to accountability, offered her a choice of assignments and a promotion to full commander. The security clearance review that Morrison had threatened disappeared without explanation, and Sarah's reputation was not only restored but enhanced by her courage in standing up to corruption. The storm itself became the subject of meteorological studies and Naval Academy case studies. Weather experts could find no scientific explanation for its sudden appearance, unprecedented intensity, or precise timing. Sailors throughout the fleet began referring to it as Chen's storm, and it became legend in the maritime community as an example of the ocean's mysterious power to enforce its own form of justice. Sarah chose to return to sea duty, accepting command of a new guided missile frigate and the respective colleagues who had witnessed her principled stand. On calm evenings, when the ocean was peaceful and the stars were bright, she would stand on the bridge and remember the day the sea itself seemed to answer her call for justice. Whether it had been coincidence or something more profound, she would never know for certain. But she would always believe that sometimes, when all human systems fail, the universe finds its own way to restore balance and honor those who serve the greater good.